Hello and welcome back to Marineford TCG. We've got quite a long way through the OP08.5 format. We've had quite a lot of tournaments over here in the West between Europe and America and Oceania. And I figured it's about time we look at what are the best decks, what's been shaping up. There's still a lot in flux in this format, I will say. There's been some pretty cool innovations just recently. See one of them in the top left here, Mr. Vegapunk. Don't think anyone expected this to win an event, but hey, what a time to be alive. So in this video, we're going to go over what my picks are for the top 10 decks. I don't think they'll be terribly controversial, but either way, we're going to go over matchups for the decks, rough matchup spreads, we're going to go over some sample lists, and I've got ratings for how much the decks are going to cost you, and their ease of play. So if you're maybe a newer player, that could maybe help you decide which of these decks to begin with. So if we move on from here, and at number 10, I've got him with Vegapunk. He might have just won a regional, but I do think he's still a little flimsy at times. You've got a pretty good Dofi matchup between Egghead Luffy and Egghead Nami removing their stuff, and them not being able to really interact with your 5-cost bodies. The Law can't bounce them. Obviously, they can bounce your 3-cost bodies, you know, the Bonnie, the Lilith, but it at least makes them a little weaker. I think your Marco matchup is pretty good. You're just really fast. I think Marco is going to struggle to keep up being a 4-life leader. Like, they've got good removal, but they don't have good enough removal, I don't think, to keep up with Vegapunk's board. I think you're just able to go too aggro. And your Nami matchup for the same reason. You're able to go wide really fast. The new 6-cost Linlin is really frustrating for Nami to deal with, because they're typically trashing all their bad cards with Kaya's anyway. So when you hit them with the Trash a Life or Trash 2 cards, both choices kind of stink for Nami. I think your purple Luffy matchup is close to 50-50. It's just going to depend whether they see their perfect curve. If they see their perfect curve, they might be able to help to deal with your board, slow you down, playing cards like Linlin. But the deck's purple Luffy is just not consistent. I think purple Luffy would be okay into Vegapunk if it was a bit more consistent. And the aggro into purple Luffy is always nice. You can't overstate that. BY, I think, is a bit of a 50-50. You can't play the long game because you can't deal with 9k leaders and Morias and Sabos. You have to just go aggro and see if they have it. A lot of times they will have it, but if they don't have like multiple black Sabos, multiple baby Sabos, keep looping their leader effect, you can cheese wins. And your Nami is really nice for dealing with their early threats. Things like Kuzan, the Trash Luffy, so on and so forth. Bad matchups, I think these black decks are pretty rough. I think both Smoker and Lucci are not matchups you're thrilled to see. Between their powerful removal on your dudes, as well as just playing a decent amount of blockers. You can deal with the blockers with Nami and Luffy, but you're going to run out eventually. And Rebecca can get pretty toxic. And now, I've not played this matchup, I don't want to, it sounds horrendous. But from what I've seen from the data, it looks like Vegapunk basically auto loses an L. Which I can see. I mean, you have one less attack on your board at all times because your leader just can't swing. And you've got no real way to interact with their big units, so it seems pretty bad. And Bonnie taking away one attack per turn and freezing with Carrot, Doflamingo. And Bonnie is also a really rough matchup. You can't really deal with that efficiently. Vegapunk, however, is very cheap. He's very cheap. You play, like, the Nami is about a £5 SR, or a $5 SR. The Luffy, I think, is around the same. S-Snake's like $1. The Linlin's in a starter deck, so it's nice and cheap. And Ace is around $5, but the whole deck's, everything else is just a common and an uncommon. So it's pretty crazy. Also, this deck is pretty hard to play because you only have 2 life. You're constantly on the verge of death. And you can't just like stack your life because then you've got no aggression on the board. Finding the balance between your aggro and not dying can be pretty tricky at times. I don't think it's the hardest deck in the game. I do think it's one that's going to take you quite a bit of getting used to get the most out of him. This is the Vegapunk list that Narayan was able to take to win the regional the other weekend. I don't think there's much to change in this list. You could swap around some of these counts. I've been tempted to go down to 2 S-Snake and 4 Atlas. But I think this list is broadly probably what you'd play. Some people are experimenting with Rhaego again to try and have an out into 8-cost Kid. Because you can't deal with that. The Bonnie matchup's already pretty bad with Carrot. Once they drop the Kid, it gets really rough. So some people are starting to experiment again with Rhaego for that. But other than that, I think this list is broadly pretty good. I wouldn't make many changes to this. In 9th place, I've got Smoker. He's just worse Lucci, kind of. He has a slightly better BY matchup. It is in this even tier. I guess I didn't go over what these actually mean. So the green, I think, are matchups that are reasonably favoured. Red are matchups that are reasonably unfavoured, and anything in white is sort of between 55 and 45. Matchups that are pretty close, can be one way or the other. For example, I think you're probably more 55 favoured into something like an L, whereas BY you're probably 55 unfavoured. Just because the Sabo, you can get through it with Tashigi, but if you don't have Tashigi, you just can't interact with them. We know how black plays into BY. Bonnie, I think, is still a good matchup. You're still black, you've got good removal into Bonnie. And Vegapunk, I think, for the same reason, you can remove their dudes quite efficiently. And in fact, I've found this can actually be better than Lucci into Vegapunk in some situations. Just because Tashigi is so efficient at removing a 5 cost. Whereas Lucci tends to need to combo events with removal. A lot of these matchups, I think, are pretty close. Doflamingo, I think, is probably slightly unfavoured. But it depends how they draw. If they don't draw many Jinbeis in the early game, you've got a good chance. But if they draw like double Jinbei, it's going to be a rough one. Purple Luffy, if they draw perfectly, if they see Magellan, they have a good chance of beating you. Obviously, Tashigi can interact with Magellan because she trashes. But Magellan's still really annoying for black decks. It slows down your progress towards Moria, amongst other things. But Purple Luffy is just inconsistent. They won't always see the Magellan, and they won't always see their curve. Enel, I think, is slightly favoured, but it's not too crazy. You haven't got as many reduction events as Lucci, so you can sometimes run out of steam in the late game. But you do have that extra bit of aggression with the leader effect, and you can interact with the Shirahoshi blocker via Tashigi to trash that rather than KO it, which is quite nice. Marco, I think, is fairly close. Black is pretty good into Marco, but I don't think we're as good as Lucci into them. We can only really remove one character per turn, which can be a little tricky when they start playing out Sanji combos. You can get run out of the game decently in the end game there. Lucci and Nami. Nami is your Nami matchup's not as bad as Lucci's Nami matchup, but it's still pretty bad. You're just too slow. And into Lucci, they're kind of just a better black deck. They can remove 2 things a turn. You can only really remove 1. You can interact with them if they play Sabo with Tashigi. But it's kind of neither here nor there. Because the late game, they will just outvalue you with the Rebecca Spanian Lucci combo. Smoker is really expensive. You need all the SRs from the starter decks. You need Morias and the Admirals, although those are very cheap now. You need like probably 3 or 4 Jacks. You need Sabos. You need Brooks. There's a lot of expensive black cards in this deck. And the skill level, I'd say, is medium high. I don't think it's as hard as Lucci in terms of black decks, because you're doing way less combos, so you don't have to pay as much attention to the math cost. But he's still decently hard. I think black decks still have a decent barrier to entry if you need to understand what your opponent is likely to do in the future. This is the Smoker deck that topped at Original a couple of weeks back. List seems pretty standard for Smoker decks. We do see the Isho, we don't see anything like Sabo or Stussy or Kaido, which is pretty interesting. He is searchable and he's nice into BY and Nami, but that matchup's kind of bad anyway. We do see the full playset of 8 searchers, which is pretty nice. 3 Hina is quite high. Full playset of Brook for only 2 Jack. I'd potentially be interested in 3 Jack, but who am I to say? You see 2 Borsellino, no Kuzan. Pretty nice. Having these blockers that can't be KO'd is really nice into decks like Marco and Lucci. And also BY. Full for Rebecca, of course. Couple Kobe to supplement your Brooks. Pretty standard Smoker deck. There's a few things here and there you could change. But, yep, here's a list if you want to give Smoker a go. Marco. So, Marco's been making quite a few waves lately, so I've bumped him up to the 8th place. Shout out to Eggman. Eggman was able to go top 8, I believe it was, in a regional just last weekend. It was either 8-1 or 9-1. He only got one loss. Very impressive. And Vampire Gaming, also a few weeks back, got top 32. Marco's been innovated quite a lot, and I haven't played enough games really to analyse the matchups, so I'm sort of going off their tournament data as well as the sim data, but it's not... This is probably the deck I'm least confident on the matchups for. So Eggman was able to defeat 4 Doflamingos. There's either 4 or 5, which I thought was pretty crazy impressive. The deck, when I've played it, has felt pretty good into Doflamingo. He wasn't playing Fire Fist, interestingly, but you can play Fire Fist, you have Newgate. Rayleigh's obviously very good. And then when their characters are tapped, just your leader effect being able to minus them down to swing into makes it a decent matchup. I think Enel is pretty good. Your Sanji combos are really hard for them to deal with. They can Raygo one guy, but you still get a big guy. And you've got pretty good early aggression. The 5-cost ace that can't be KO'd is kind of annoying for them to deal with. Nami, you're just able to go very fast. You can go like on curve, Sanji into something else, and then play Dragon. That next turn is going to be devastating. You also have decent removal for their low-cost characters. Between, you know, your Fire Fist, your Seaquake, or Newgate, I guess. Although I will say the list without events is probably a bit weak into Nami. I think Smoker is probably a pretty even matchup. They can't really deal with the Sanji combos, but in the early game they will be able to remove your stuff pretty efficiently. Ace is not too crazy into Smoker, but it's still pretty good. BY Luffy, again, they don't love seeing 2 9 costs on your 9 or 10 on turn. They really don't love seeing that. You can play Raging Tiger to get rid of their guys. You can play Pudding to frustrate them. I think it's a pretty close matchup. If they can weather the storm and get to the point where they're chaining Warriors, they're probably in a pretty good spot. If you can play Sanji on curve, it's quite nice for you. I don't think the matchup's too far either way. And I think similar things about Bonnie. You can go very wide very fast with obviously the Ironkovs in the early game, and then the Sanjis in the late game. Bonnie hates going wide. Kid is useless into Marco. And even Doflamingo is not great because you have rush options with Dragon. You can go like Sanji into Dragon. It's just crazy. It's a crazy play. Lucci, I do think is a rough matchup. I'm well aware that Eggman was able to defeat like an ungodly amount of Luccis, but he did say, I think there was only 1 Moria played between them, which is insane. I think I can count the amount of games I've played against a Lucci, and they've seen no Moria. I can barely think of any, I'll be honest. I feel like it's a pretty lucky run. I do think Lucci is a pretty bad matchup for you. They've got so much reduction. They're going to be removing all of your early game aggression with Ivankov. The ace is pretty nice, especially if you leave it standing up. And then late game, they will struggle to deal with a Sanji combo, but you're going to struggle to pull 2 Sanji combos off. And Rebecca is quite annoying, especially if you're playing a list that doesn't run Seaquake. Vegapunk, I don't really know how this matchup goes, but data suggests it's bad. I don't know, more testing needed on that one. And Purple Luffy, they're able to go really wide, really fast. I think Marco's just going to get rushed down by Purple Luffy. I think they've got, if they see their curve, of course. With Purple Luffy, it's always contingent on if they see their curve. You're much better at removing Doflamingo's bodies than Purple Luffy's, because these come out tapped, these don't. And these are bigger and come out faster with the ramp, of course. Here is Eggman's list that he was able to go X and 1 at the regional with. Very impressive performance from Eggman. Shout out to him. Check out this list. This is pretty cool. Atmos is like a budget version of the lore that Dofi can play. You've got Ace, you've got Newgate. Newgate and Rayleigh really good into Doflamingo. You got a nice selection of 2 costs here. We've got Duval and Pudding, which we've seen before, and Dadan is a new one, which can just get you a little bit of extra value finding a Thatch, an Izo, or an Otama. And then if you've got a 5k Jinbei or something rested, you minus it down with leader effect and Dadan can attack into it, which is kind of cute. Nothing too crazy in this list. Just remove the events is probably the biggest thing. This Atmos is new, and the Dadan. But yeah, remove the events. And he did also suggest that you could even remove Gravity Blade in favour of 9-cost Mihawk, which would be pretty cool. It might make your BY matchup even better. If you can play a big dude whilst bottom decking one of their big dudes, that seems pretty good. But either way, yeah, here's a Marco list. Check it out. Give it a go. Purple Luffy. Oh, we didn't go over the price of Marco. He's cheap, but his skill level is very high. If you make one mistake with Marco, you're done. Like, you're so flimsy having only 4 life. It's a tough deck to play. Okay, next up we've got Purple Luffy. So, Purple Luffy is a pretty strong deck when it draws well. The biggest issue I have with this deck currently is just the consistency. If you're playing into black and you see Magellan, you're laughing. If you're playing into some of these other decks and you see your curve, you know, your Zoro into Luffy Taro play out Sangoro, the deck feels really good, but when you don't see that, and that's more often than I'd like, the deck is very weak. I do think you have a pretty free matchup into Nami. Doesn't really matter what characters you see, you're playing big characters fast. As long as you don't just draw complete garbage, you should be really fine into Nami. I think your Marco matchup, it's obviously dependent on you seeing your stuff, but Magellan is pretty annoying for them because they have to KO it if they want to remove it. And going wide fast is pretty annoying. They can't really deal with the Luffy Taro very early at all. The earliest turn they can do it is like 9 when they can do leader effect plus Rayleigh. Which by then, hopefully you've got double Luffy Taro and 2 targets on the board. Your BY matchup as well, you can go pretty fast. If you're playing Nika, that's pretty cool. You're probably not playing Nika, but you know, it's an option. And being able to go wide fast, you create some interesting situations for them. It's not super favoured, but I think it's a pretty decent matchup. You've also got Usohachi to rest the Sabos, which is very relevant. Mid-ground, I've put Smoker. I think your Smoker and Lucci matchups aren't that dissimilar. Smoker's just a slightly worse deck. I've put him in the close matchups and Lucci in unfavourable. If you see Magellan into these decks, you're laughing. If you don't, it feels pretty bad, I'm not going to lie. Vegapunk, I think, is pretty close. They need to see their Namis to control your board. Their Egghead Luffy is fine, but it can't get rid of Sangoro. And Sangoro is really good in this matchup. Going wide is also really powerful. I think it's just kind of close. If they see their stuff early and they see Namis to control your board, they're in a decent spot. If not, you might just take home the win. And I think kind of the same for Enel. You've got to go fast. You need to see double Luffy Taros or multiple Magellans, one or the other. Magellan is very annoying for Enel because it just slows the game down, but in the early game. Enel wants to slow the game down later on once they can start doing their, they're big guys. So slowing it down early on with Magellan can be pretty nice and hard for them to remove. Yeah, they can Katakuri it to the bottom of your life, but if they're not at 8 Don, well, they can't do that. Your bad matchups, Doflamingo is horrendous. You can't beat Doflamingo. You can draw the absolute nuts, and they can draw pretty bad, and you'll still lose. They're just too aggro. They have too many guys. You have to take your own life. It's a recipe for disaster. Lucci is not great. If you see multiple Magellans, of course you can win. But if you're not seeing Magellan, or if you're not playing Magellan, this matchup's pretty tough. It can get pretty hairy. And Bonnie as well, they get so much value out of their leader effect. Carrot is nuts into you. You don't have great ways to deal with 8-cost Kid. You do have some bigger characters, but nothing too crazy. Usohachi is nice to rest their blockers, but either way, I think Bonnie has a strong favourite into Purple Luffy. In terms of price, if you play Mr. 2 Bon Clay, it's probably a 2 out of 3 dollar signs, but if you choose to play a list without Mr. 2, this is really cheap. Like, there's not much else that has much value outside of the Mr. 2. Magellan does in America, but it's quite cheap in Europe still. In terms of skill level, I'd say this is a pretty beginner-friendly deck. The playlines mostly play themselves. It's not super free, but it's a fairly straightforward deck. There's obviously things you can do. That's true of every deck, but in general, I'd say this is pretty beginner-friendly. Here's a sample Luffy list. This is pretty standard. There's nothing too crazy here. This player is not opting for Magellan, which is probably the only thing of note. If you were to play the Magellan, you probably cut one Kaido and then some amount of these blockers between the Law, Queen, and Kid. You just pick your least favourite and stick in for Magellan. But yeah, this list's not too crazy. Next up, Nami. Sorry, I just fell asleep. I'm here. So this deck's really boring to play against. I kind of like playing Nami, I can't lie. I do enjoy playing Nami a bit, but it's so dull to play against. If you're a Nami player, you've got to empathise with your opponents. They don't want to sit there and do this. But either way, you've got a free win pretty much into Lucci. Same with Smoker, although Smoker's slightly worse. Bonnie, I was surprised because last format Bonnie was like a reasonably close matchup, but because they're cutting the Zoro, going by the sim data, it looks like it's atrocious. Like it's just a free win for Nami. Which I kind of get. Like, if you're cutting Zoro, all you've got is Hody Jones. And Hody Jones is good, but... yeah, he's no Zoro. So yeah, you've got a free win into Bonnie, apparently. I haven't played this matchup in 08.5, though. I will say that caveat. And you have a free matchup into Nell. This has always been the case. BY Luffy, just depends how fast they can go. If they see Trash Luffy early, you're in for a rough time. If they don't see Trash Luffy early, you're cooking. You're kind of cooking. Once they get to that point where their leader's activated and they're playing out 100 dudes for free and their leader's massive, it becomes really tricky for Nami to win. But until then, if your opponent has a little bit of a rough start, you can win. I think this matchup is slightly unfavored for Nami, but it's not too crazy. And in terms of bad matchups, I think Marco's just too fast, going wide with Ivankov, then going wide with Sanji. And they also have the rush options with the Ace, the Dragon, and any other rush options they're choosing to play. Vegapunk, same reason, they're just too fast. And it's the same for all these decks, really. Doflamingo, Purple Luffy, Vegapunk, just too fast for Nami. You can't really deal with it. Can you win? Absolutely. Of these decks, what's the hardest? Probably Purple Luffy, then probably Doflamingo, then probably Vegapunk. Marco's probably a bit more winnable if they have slightly suboptimal draws. But either way, I think all these are pretty tough. You're kind of just playing matchup roulette if you play this deck. You match a bunch of Luccis and Enels and Bonnies, you could easily win original, no questions asked. But if all you're facing is Doflamingo, it's going to be a rough day at the office. This deck is dirt cheap. There's nothing in this deck with any value anymore. The last card's like Pilaf, but that just got reprinted in PRB. So if you want to pick this up, you could probably build this for like 20 bucks. You could probably get all the commons from your locals as well. I will say it's a pretty tricky deck to play. I don't think it's as difficult as it used to be. Or maybe that's just me getting better, but I think the new additions that Nami's got in the last couple of sets have made the deck just stronger inherently. So it's a little bit less hard to find the win lines, I think is what I'm getting at. Here's a Nami list. It's fairly standard. This one was I think this won a regional, I believe, out in Oceania. Or at least got like top. One of this Zeph for the mirror, 3 of this Zeph, which is pretty interesting. You don't often see 3 Zeph. I think a lot of people are back on 1, but 3 is pretty cool. Lets you go a bit more aggro into maybe into the Dofi matchup. You can go with Zeph, and they can't really interact with it outside of Jozu. And if they're playing Jozu, that's pretty slow. Maybe it's decent into Dofi. I don't know. I haven't really played much Nami in this format. I don't want to play matchup roulette. We just see one perfume theme, which is interesting. You don't always see this. But yeah, other than that, pretty standard Nami list. Let's move on. Next up, we've got Enel at number 5. So I think Enel is a decent play right now. If you're expecting a lot of Doflamingo and Vegapunk, these aggro decks, you can really control their board with Egghead Luffy, Egghead Nami, even Gadatsu into Doflamingo. Not so much into Vegapunk, but we don't worry about that. So against Vegapunk, it's just really hard for them to go for lethal. Because their leader can't attack, the most they can have is 5 swings. Those 6 if they want to play an ace from hand. But realistically, it's 5. and if you're at 2 life, they need 4 to go through. So 1 trigger and like a couple counters from hand can just completely ruin their day. Your top end is also really good into them. They can't interact with your top end. Katakuri, Yamato, they're just too big. They're just too big, and you're going to accumulate cards in the early game by taking your first couple life. Smoker and Lucci are both pretty similar. Smoker's a slightly worse deck, so I'd say your Lucci matchup's slightly tougher. They also play more reduction events, which is notable, but Smoker does play bigger characters that KO bigger costs. I'm thinking the Tashigi, maybe a Sakazuki, or maybe even a Stussy. Whereas Lucci needs to do their event plus Moria combo, but that's pretty spooky to be fair. The Lucci matchup mostly just comes down to how well the Lucci opponent plays and draws. I think it's slightly unfavoured for NL, but it's not too bad. They've cut a lot of the cards that you didn't like to see, the Stussy, the 8-cost Sabo, things like that. And Smoker's much the same. If your opponent draws really well, you're going to have a tough time. If not, you've got a good chance to beat them. Blackula Luffy, I'd say, is very close to a 50-50. You could argue it's favoured either way, to be honest. NL just slows the game down, plays out massive dudes. Really hard for BY to go for lethal, because obviously you can get triggers. Also, you're just sitting at 2 life. And a lot of the time they don't want to attack with their dudes, which is kind of awkward. Or they're just attacking for like 6s with Sabos. Purple Luffy, I think, is slightly favoured for NL. I've played this matchup a little bit now, and it really feels like if they just whiff anything, you're in a really good spot. Obviously, Magellan is annoying, but beyond that, I think the matchup's fine for you. It's not too crazy. They can go a bit wild if they get like double Luffy Taro early or multiple Magellans. But outside of that, I think you're in a pretty good spot versus Purple Luffy. Nami's horrendous, you just lose. You're way too slow. Bonnie's slightly unfavoured now because they have the Shanks. The Shanks is really annoying, just clearing one of your units while establishing their own. And of course, Dofi chains are still around, and they're still pretty frustrating. And Marco, I do think Marco is not the worst matchup. It's probably only slightly unfavoured. But if they can go wide with Sanji, if they can play multiple Sanjis, that's really tough. If they got like 4 big dudes on the board, it's hard to play into. In terms of price, I'd give him 2. You could argue it's 1 now that Katakuri has really come down in price. But you still need 4 of them. You still need 4 Ace. You need 4 Nami, 4 Luffy. All these SRs that have a little bit of value here and there. But it's not too expensive now. And in terms of skill level, I'd definitely say NL is beginner friendly. There's obviously nuance. There's nuance with every deck. We've said this time and time again. But I do think that NL is definitely one of the easier decks to get into. If you were going to choose either NL or Lucci, for example, NL is way easier to play because you don't need to know what your opponent's going to do as much. It's still helpful though. And also you can get wins against bad opponents. Bad opponents playing into NL is always funny. Here's a sample NL list. Pretty standard stuff. You got 2 of the Shirahoshi blocker, just 1 Russian L. Opting not to play Gadatsu is probably the only interesting thing. Other than that, this is a pretty standard NL list. Number 4, I've gone with Bonnie. I think Bonnie is in a really weird place in the meta right now. Because you have some really good matchups and some really bad matchups. Like BY Luffy, which is, in my opinion, one of the strongest decks in the meta. It's not just my opinion, that's a fact. BY Luffy is one of the strongest decks in the meta. And Bonnie's pretty good into it. You have a pretty good matchup. Between being able to rest their blockers if they swing after doing their combos. Being able to remove their Morias if it's not protected by Shanks. By Sabo with Shanks, which is unlikely but could come up. Doflamingo is really good into them. 10-cost Dofi just denies them all their tempo. And as well, Hody Jones just resting their Sabo blockers. You'll probably run them out of tempo most of the time. And yeah, Dofi chaining is just so strong. They have no pressure if you can effectively Dofi chain them. Enel is kind of the same. You can Dofi chain him and you now have Shanks to remove his dudes, which is pretty good. Purple Luffy, they're fast, but when you're resting their guys and freezing them with Carrot, it's tough for them. And yeah, Vegapunk is very good because they just don't have enough swings. I think Marco and Doflamingo are both pretty close. They're They're sort of both aggro decks that can deal with your guys a little bit. If you see the right stuff though, if you see Carrot into Dofi, it's pretty good. If you see Kid into Dofi, it's pretty good. Dofi can tech, they can play Kaido, they can play Red Rock. A lot of them aren't, but it just kind of comes down to, are you playing the techs a lot of the time? You got to beware Pudding though. Pudding is brutal against Bonnie, because you tend to just have a lot of cards naturally. And that goes the same for Pudding and Marco. Nami is shocking unless you're playing 9-core Zoro. If you want to tech for Nami, just slap a couple Zoros in there and try and find them. Lucci is a pretty bad matchup, and same with Smoker. You can absolutely beat these black decks. It tends to involve them getting unlucky on their events, on finding their events, and you Dofi chaining them into a Hody Jones. It tends to be how it works out, but yeah, the ball's definitely in their court. Bonnie's reasonably expensive. You need a lot of SRs and higher end cards. You need Cavendish, who's like $10 a piece. Carrot's got a few dollars to her name. Kid's cheaper now. Dofi's also cheaper now. It's definitely not an expensive deck, but it's got a little bit of value here and there. But I would say the skill level is pretty high. You've got to know what to expect from your opponent. You've got to know their best plays. You've got to be able to try and read them. See what they're going to do. Can you safely drop Kid? Can you safely drop Dofi? It's a tough one. It's going to be a tougher one to play. Not super crazy, but definitely not an easy deck to pick up. This is a sample Bonnie list. This is playing double searchers, which is pretty common now. We do see the full playset of Carrot. This is for Dofi. Just one Shanks in this list, which is interesting. I think a lot of people are on 2, but 1's fine. Full playset of Dofi. I think this card's just nuts. This card's just crazy. And same with Hody Jones. This wins you so many games. Resting double blockers, or Dons, I guess, is pretty just pretty good. We do see 3 Kid. This is for the Dofi matchup. And you've got a whole host of blockers to play off him. You've got Rosinante, Beige, and Killer. Yeah, not too crazy here. No 8-cost Rosinante is probably the only notable thing, but that's not that common anyway. And Carrot really has taken over Bonnie in this slot. No Arouge as well. People have really stopped playing Arouge. It's too easy to remove. Between Black and Dofi being able to bounce it with Law, it's just not that great anymore. But anyway, moving on from Bonnie. My pick for number 3 is Lucci. I think Lucci is a very strong deck, but he just has a couple tough matchups in the top tier. Into Bonnie, you're fine. Purple Luffy, you're fine. If they see Magellans, it gets harder. Smoker, you're just a better black deck. You're going to outvalue them eventually. Marco, I think you can just remove enough of their stuff in the early game. As long as you draw like a 4-cost Lucci, you can just remove the entire Ivankov play basically for free. Brook's also nuts in this matchup. Vegapunk, they can out-aggro you if you get pretty unlucky, but generally speaking, I think you're pretty good into Vegapunk. You've got to be very patient. You've got to be willing to play the long game, similar to how you would play into something like Enel. But I do think the Vegapunk is a little bit easier because they don't have any late game. Enel and Dofi, I think, are pretty close. Enel, you can get to the point where you're looping your deck, like we said. I think Lucci is slightly favoured into that, but it's not too crazy. They can win if they get the right aggro in the early game, or if you just don't find your events. Doflamingo, it all comes down to how fast they go. If they draw like 2, 3, 4 Jinbeis, you're gonna have a tough time. But I think generally speaking, they don't draw that many. Then maybe see 2, but 3 is a bit of a rough end of the stick for you, I think. And you can, once you settle into the mid to late game, your Dofi matchups gets better. You get to this point in the game where you're like, right, I'm fine now. We've got this. You do see Warriors, but that's true for everything. The reason I'm putting this deck at 3 rather than 2 or 1, I think is mostly just the consistency. You'll usually see a Moria, but how many Morias you see is just kind of luck of the draw. Against NL, you can loop the deck because the deck is slow. But against these other decks, you just kind of got to draw them, and that can be a little just RNG reliant sometimes. BY Luffy is a really not great matchup. You can tech for it with things like Nightmare Luffy, Kaido, the Brook that trashes a 4. But then you're not teching for Doflamingo, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. I think no matter how much you tech, this matchup is still going to be quite unfavoured. And Nami is a shocking matchup. You have very little game into Nami. Lucci is very expensive. You're typically playing a lot of Sabos, you're playing a lot of Brooks. A lot of the other cards have come down in value. But just between Sabo and Brook, I'm willing to give this a full $3 out of $3 for price. I would say this is a high skill deck. You need to know what to expect from your opponent, when you can use your events, when you have to save them, when you should go for removal, when you need to start going aggro. And you also have all the math combos with the cost, of course. You'll get used to them, but it's something to learn. Here is a sample Lucci list that topped a regional recently. This is a pretty cool list. It's got double Soap Sheep, which is pretty cool for the Dofi matchup. Also got one Kaku and a full playset of Jax for the Dofi matchup. You got one Hina. A lot of people are on one Hina now. It can be pretty nice. If you've got Jack on the board, you can go Rebecca Hina and it's crazy how big a guy you can remove. If you have Jack on the board, you can go Moria, Rebecca, Hina, Helmeppo, and that removes a 10. That removes a 10. It's crazy. We've got two Borsellino. Is a little bit of a rogue pick. Some people are on Kuzan in this slot. Some people are on Borsellino. Some people are on more Sabos. We just see one Sabo in this list, which is pretty interesting. I do think Sabo generally is dropping in counts in a lot of decks because there's less Black Mirrors, and this card's pretty not great into things like Doflamingo. Like, it can block a hit, sure, but that's not that good, and they can Jozu it. But yeah, this is a pretty cool Lucci list. I'd give this one a go, see what you think. I think this deck is very powerful, just not 100% consistent on finding the Morias, and can have a rough time if you see too many BYs. Number 2, Doflamingo. So this is the biggest new deck out of 8.5. You gain so much from these style decks, man. This deck's gone kind of crazy. You got a great matchup into Purple Luffy, it's basically free, and your Nami matchup is close to free as well. A lot of these matchups are pretty close, just kind of depending on how well you draw. Bonnie, if you get enough Doflamingo, enough of Jinbeis, sorry, you're in a pretty good spot. But this also depends on your techs a lot. If you're playing things to answer Kid, if you're not playing anything to answer Kid, it can get a little rough. Lucci, just depends how fast you can go, how many Morias they see. This is a close matchup. There's not much to separate these two decks. Smoker, again, is the same. You're probably slightly better into Smoker just because the deck's slightly worse. But they can be kind of annoying. They get a free buff off of your searches. They can swing 7 into 5 on your tapped 5k dudes, which is kind of annoying. And Tashigi is really good into you. Tashigi is really good into you. BY Luffy, if you're playing the text for BY, the matchup's good. If you're not playing the text for BY, matchup's bad. Who goes first matters a lot here as well. But yeah, if you're playing like Red Rock and Raging Tiger, you're obviously playing Pudding. You can have a better time into BY, and the same if you're playing Kaido. If you're forgoing the events completely, it can be pretty tough. BY can really get a stranglehold in the late game. Vegapunk and NL, these yellow decks are just kind of built to beat Doflamingo. They got so many triggers and ways to kill your dudes. It's a rough time. And Marco, the same, has a lot of removal for your low power characters, which is not something you love to see. Doflamingo is really cheap. The only card that really has any value is Jinbei. There's a couple other cards that are worth like $1 to $3, but Jinbei is the only card with any real value. I'd say this is a medium high skill deck. There's a lot of depth with Doflamingo, but to get into playing him at a base level, it's not too hard to pick up and play. There's obviously a lot of improvement. A good Doflamingo player and a bad Doflamingo player is a massive gulf, but I do think it's one of the easier decks to start playing to begin with. If you're a completely new player, I definitely recommend Doflamingo over Lucci, because it is a lot more intuitive. Here's a Doflamingo list. I kind of like this one. It's playing the Kaido. I think the Kaido is pretty cool. Also playing this 7-cost Dofi, which is a bit of a unique tech. Really nice in Mirror, because it can get rid of Jozu and can't be gotten rid of by Jozu. One of the FEMA, pretty standard. One Raging Tiger, I think is nice. It's really nice into so many matchups. Mirror, it's fine. Into BY, it's pretty good. Even into Bonnie, it can be decent to get rid of like their early carrots, which is pretty cool. Other than that, this is fairly standard. Just 2 of the Moria, 3 of the Perona, and 4 of the Buggy is interesting. You sometimes see this the other way around, but This is pretty standard to what Dofi's going to do at this point. These sort of cards down here are your main tech slots. Only 2 Jozu as well. A lot of people are on 3 or 4 of those. But yep, give this list a go, see what you think. And I didn't... I forgot to change the number up here. This is number 1. This is number 1. I'll go and change it now. We'll make a cut. You saw nothing. He's number 1, see? BY Luffy, I think, is the best deck in the game. This is a very, very hard deck to play. I think this is the hardest deck in the game to play. There's very little mistakes you could afford to make with this deck. You've got to know everything inside out. You've got to know the matchup, when you can afford to take, when you have to counter, when you need to protect your guys, when you can just let them go. Your deck's very consistent. You can still whiff if you don't see the Black Sabo. You're going to lose like every game if you don't see Black Sabo. But you've got a good amount of searches. You've got Garp, you've got 3 Brothers Bond. Your life are effectively just extra resources you get to play the game. You don't really start playing the game until you're at 0 life. You've got a great matchup into Lucci. Can you lose? Yeah, obviously. But it's tough to lose. It's a really good matchup. I think a lot of your matchups are very close, slightly favoured for BY. Doflamingo depends on the techs. But I think generally it's slightly favoured for BY. Vegapunk depends how fast they're able to go, but again, I think generally slightly favoured for BY. Once you get to 9k leader, Vegapunk's cooked. Marco, I think Marco's probably slightly unfavoured for BY because they can go pretty wide, pretty fast with the Sanji combos. Nami, it just depends how well you draw. If you see your trash Luffy's, you're laughing. If not, you're gonna struggle. Smoker, I think, is pretty favourable for BY, but not as favourable as Lucci because they do have the Tashigi to deal with your Sabos, and they do also just gain a 1000 power buff off of your Garps and Flampeys that you play out. Enel, I think, is one of the closer matchups. They can interact with you. They can put your Morias in life with Katakuri, which is pretty funny. But beyond that, the NL matchup, I think, is just mostly close. We've gone over all these already, but I'll go over them again just in case people are skipping to this part of the video. Purple Luffy, I think, is a slightly rough matchup just because they're so fast and their bodies are hard for you to deal with. Egghead Luffy is great into something like Doflamingo. It's not so great into Luffy because it can't deal with Luffy Taro, can't deal with Sangoro, obviously can't deal with Magellan. And Bonnie, I think, is a pretty tough matchup. There's not a lot you can do into Bonnie. You've got to kind of hope for the heart of the cards, really. They start Dofi chaining you, it gets really tough. But yeah, I think this deck's pretty expensive. You need a full playset of Sabo. That's enough to give it $2 in my book. It's not crazy dear. Nothing in this game is. The game's got really cheap lately, which is awesome to see, I can't lie. And like we said, I think this deck is a very hard deck to play. As we look at the list, this is mostly just the same as it's always been. You've got a couple tech slots. This Sabo is a tech slot. How many aces you play is optional. Kuzan and this Nami's a pretty cool tech. She's a blocker. Excuse me. And on play, if you have an 8 cost character and 6 or less cards in your hand, you draw a card, which is pretty nice. In those late game turns, it's just like a chump blocker that gets you a card, which is pretty cool. You could summon it off Moria, I guess. I don't really know where this is played that much, but it's only a one-off, it's not too crazy. Kuzan's really good into green, he's really good into yellow. He's generically just pretty good as well into like Lucci if they play a 5 cost. Then you can just remove it with Kuzan plus Egghead Luffy. This Egghead Luffy really just brought this deck into a whole new light. This deck's crazy. And that's it for my video on the top 10 decks in OP08.5. Let me know your opinions in the comments below. Do you agree with my takes? Do you think they're terrible? You'd probably think they're terrible. But here we are. I've been struggling to keep up with some of the decks near the bottom of this list. The Smoker. I love Smoker, but I'm fucking yapping about.